from Duo Security and his talk on security for the people.
It's always good to start with applause in case you hate my talk, then at least I got that at some point. Can everyone hear me okay? There's not too many, so just, come up, sit back, whatever you want to do. All right, so this talk, working for a two-factor company, it's really easy just to say like, oh, two-factor solves everything and panacea and silver bullets and all that. But the reality is, like, I did security assessments. I realized that there are two-factor bypasses. Sometimes we find them, like in PayPal. I realized that, if you attack people's sessions, two-factor really doesn't mean a whole lot. So I really wanted to look at beyond two-factor, what about end-user authentication security on the internet? So if you control for two-factor, what happens? How do people stack up when they implement security for kind of end user experience? So Bruce meme to start any good talk. Honestly, like it's been played out a couple of million times, but the first time I read Secrets and Lies and saw that sentence that security is a process, not a product, it really resonated with me. And I still believe it. And I think there's no better example of that than when we talk about authentication security. It doesn't matter if you use Duo, we would love you to, but there's a lot of ways to own people that are using two-factor still. And we need to look holistically at what's happening and not just talk about one security control. We need to look at kind of the ecosystem of controls around authentication. So like any good research, here's some notes that you'll need to play along and understand what happened here. So I took a list of mostly from twofactorauth.org, which is a fantastic site if you haven't been there before, and took out kind of some things I didn't agree with on, whether it was a service that really didn't have two-factor or it was a service that was a software package, it was a software package, not a service. So everything we're talking about today is a site, a service, whether that's, it could be a SaaS thing, it could be retail, it could be social media, but the point is it's a website of some sort, mostly targeted to consumer space. So this isn't a product you buy that has two-factor. This isn't software you download and install that has two-factor. These are sites on the internet that have two-factor deployed as an option. What's cool about that is we can really think about, okay, so you have these sites that have two-factor. So the inclination would be like, oh, they're all like super security forward, and all these sites, of course, have all this other security control implementation that they've done. And that's kind of one of the questions I had. And one of the assumptions that I would have made before is if you're a service that offers two-factor to your users, you're going to have good security overall for authentication. And you'll find out if that's true or not in this research set. But so that was one thing I was looking at. So other than two-factor, we're looking at TLS usage and implementation, browser header usage, cookie security, kind of all these different moving parts of authentication security when it comes down to things. So it's not just the authentication, it's the session after the authentication. Because again, authentication doesn't really mean a lot if you get compromised client side with a cross-site scripting attack because you didn't use the right browser headers or something. I certainly focused on data completeness. It took me a lot more time than I would have expected. Most of the research I do is breaking stuff, and that's very quick usually. And then you put slides together and make fun of what you broke. Doing data research is something I didn't do a lot of before, and it's very time consuming. So I really focused on accuracy, whether that's reaching out to a company to ask them for, hey, when did you deploy two-factor? Or could you tell me more about this feature that I think is working this way? It's just a very slow process when you're looking at about 100, I think my data set's 141 sites, and many, many data points per site. Takes some effort to get the right data. But again, this is not a scientific study. I think it's interesting research, and I think the data set's pretty damn good. But again, I wouldn't hold this up to some of the work academics are doing in this space necessarily. And as I mentioned, software packages don't get included. This is sites and services. So here's a little bit of the bigger picture of what we're looking at. So kind of the breaking down of the two-factor part, which, as I said, we're controlling for. So everything has two-factor of some sort. We'll look into what they're doing, how they're doing it, that kind of thing. Transport security, so SSL implementation, and then a bunch of browser headers, cookie security, and again getting to the big picture and not just looking at one thing to rule them all. As I said, doing data research is time consuming, especially when you're working with sources of data truth that don't necessarily want to give you what the truth is. This conversation I had with Fairwinds Credit Union, And, you know, if you look at my Twitter history, a lot of it looks like this, like, hey, I saw you had two-factor. Could you tell me when you deployed it? Or sometimes I'd say, like, what methods do you support? And just kind of getting some, you know, data resolution if it wasn't published kind of very forward to the consumer. And in this case, they say, you know, we do not disclose details regarding our internal security operations. Thank you. And I'm like, I didn't ask about your internal security operations. I asked about a feature that you promote as something that customers are allowed to use. I just asked for a date of when you added that feature. And they never replied back after my rebuttal, so that didn't go well. But yeah, I mean, that happens, you know, certainly between the overlap between a security team or developer team and then the social media representation of that brand is not always, you know, very in sync. So we'll kind of have this broken up in parts, and then we'll make some, you know, weak and strong correlations, hopefully, of how data is somewhat related and what we see as far as trends. But one thing I want to do is looking at when people deploy two-factor. Certainly that data is spotty at best. More and more often, especially kind of the SaaS companies are very forward about, you know, they'll have a blog post when they add a security feature, especially with all the compromises we see happening, all the breaches we see happening, data loss. People really, really like to talk about when they add a security feature now, as long as they kind of think their customer base will care about that. You know, so historically, we definitely see a ramp. And keep in mind, this data is through it's technically actually through July 2014 at this point. But if we look at 2013, there were 47 sites that deployed two-factor. As of July, end of July roughly, so, you know, 7 months in, we were at 30. So assumably at the end of the year, assuming some sort of linear type growth in that data set, you know, we'll be around 60 or something around there. So pretty interesting, and I'm curious to see if that trend continues. I think it will. I think there's always a little bit of a momentum swing with any of these kinds of things, where your competitor in the market has a feature. Now your customers are saying, well, why don't you have that feature? Or you get breached and go, well, this company got breached, and their response was to do A, B, C, and D, one of which is add two-factor to the service to placate people and make them feel better about things. So I think we'll kind of keep seeing that trend going towards more adoption of two-factor. Now, certainly how they do two-factor, what methods they support, all that, you know, is up in the air for some degree. In 2011, we saw Google deploy two-factor. So they have Google Authenticator, which is just in the current Google Authenticator deployment of the mobile app. It supports top P and hot P, so time-based one-time passwords, hash-based one-time passwords. So, you know, open standards, RFCs, good stuff to use if you're in that OTP generation kind of two-factor mindset. And then Facebook actually has had two-factor for longer than most people realize, and they support SMS as well as top P. Now, certainly when you get a driver and a company like Google that releases a free app that, of course, ties into their service, but also implements open standards, adoption for people is pretty good. You certainly want to be like Google in most of the time. And we certainly have seen a trend with adoption. And we'll talk about the moniker of how people call two-factor, or other words that I think you might find interesting as well. One thing going into this research, I assumed that there would actually be more companies and services that required you to kind of jump over a few hurdles to add two-factor. You know, I assumed whether it was email or faxing or some other terrible method, antiquated means of asking for a security feature, most of the time, perhaps save for when someone's in kind of a beta period for adding two-factor, it actually is self-enrollment, which is great. Self-enrollment of security features is the right way to do things. You want to enable users to add security that they're willing to take on, that kind of risk versus convenience trade-off. You certainly don't want to hinder people from giving themselves better security with your service. That would be really bad. But, you know, financial institutions, especially ones that are still handing out physical tokens and don't support things like, or at least clearly support things like top P, for instance, you know, they still make you jump through the hurdle of calling them or faxing them or emailing them, asking for a token, receiving it in the mail, going through that kind of activation process. Overall, though, certainly a high percentage and a good thing to see. So this graph here is talking about across all services, So this isn't one-to-one. So, all 141 services, I actually broke down as granularly as possible without killing myself, what types of two-factor they offered. And so this is a collection of all methods across all services. And perhaps no surprise, Top P is pretty well up there. So basically, 1 out of every 2 sites supports Top P as a method. SMS, again, not a huge shock, is also, because everyone that wants to add two-factor on the cheap, grabs Twilio and, does some SMS backend stuff and calls it a day. Email is, hurts my soul, that's a valid form of two-factor in most cases. There's a lot of attack surface there and a lot of bad things that can happen. I was really happy to see. I'm a big fan of YubiKey and Yubico in general. I was happy to see the number of implementations of YubiKey directly. And one thing to mention, Duo, Authy, and Rublon. What I'm saying there is, for instance, Authy and Duo both support Top P in our mobile apps, but we actually have our own platforms. So when it says 6 and 10 or 12 there, that's the native platform for our services. That's not the fact you could use our mobile app to achieve two-factor. So I tried to not just conflate all these different things, and I tried to break them out as, yep. Sure. Duo Security and Authy and Rublon, they actually have their own two-factor as a service. So the number up there is actually representative of implementing the platform that we provide. Our mobile applications support the open Top P and Hot P standards, but those are broken out separately. So again, trying to get as much resolution on what's happening here. Token is a lot of the token stuff, as you might imagine, is a lot of historical financial industry, gaming industry. Tokens have been around for quite a while in both of those segments. And then card, I kind of did conflate card a little bit. So that might be a OTP card that you keep in your wallet. There was actually one site that actually had a matrix card, if anyone's remember using those. And then Hot P, which isn't a huge surprise. Hot P has more overhead. If you're not familiar, you basically have a counter that you have to maintain on both sides of the equation and can get out of sync and bad things happen. Whereas Top P is actually time-based. And so that actually takes away that need to kind of keep that counter going and synchronized. So Hot P's been phased out if it was used. There are some sites that started one way and then transitioned. Bitcoin, of course, has been a huge driver, both in the general two-factor implementation, but as well as Top P. That's been a big thing that we've seen. The percentages show that to be true. And like I said, financial and gaming are most of the implementation of hardware tokens at this point. And one thing to keep in mind, a lot of these services may have had different mechanisms at one point. I tried to find the most current representation of what they offered. So perhaps 10 years ago, Bank A didn't support SMS or didn't support email or whatever. This is as current of data as I could get for each company to kind of be representative of what's happening now. Certainly one thing that most of us will notice on the internet when we go to sites and services, I think Amazon, in my opinion, Amazon Web Services is a good example where they don't really promote the fact they have two-factor very well. And when you want to enable two-factor, it's kind of like, oh, do you support Top P or not? Where do I have to go to actually initialize it? It's kind of wonky. Zoho, the first time I logged into them, they had this interstitial basically of, hey, here's what two-factor is. Here's why you should use it. Do you want to set it up right now? That's the first login for this site. I think making it that security forward is a great way to do things. Every single service, all 141 sites I tested, I actually have credentials for. So I logged into every single one, and I think there might have been 2 or 3 total that actually prompted me to enable two-factor on the get-go. So that's certainly, if you are a service provider, if you have a site and you guys enable two-factor for customers, whether it's a little banner at the top when someone logs in or a splash like this, it would be great if you kind of put that a little more forward. One other thing I was really interested in going into this is I can think of a bunch of services that I use that support two-factor and only support Top P or only support SMS. And I was curious to see, across all these sites and services and segments, what kind of capabilities do they each have? How many methods of two-factor? personally, being part of a two-factor company, one thing I noticed that fails in the two-factor space is accommodating the user rather than like pushing the user into a workflow or a security model. Most things that have 51% only offer you one way to do two-factor. So if your way is not the way that you want it to be, so if you, let's say you're an international user and I'm a US North American company and I don't want to support you for SMS for data, for the cost that would be associated with, well, now I can't use your service and that sucks. So to me, that's a big hurdle for two-factor adoption in general. It is not giving users enough choices on how to integrate two-factor in their lifestyle. So looking at this, you can definitely see that overall it's kind of concerning. So 33% offer two, and of the time when there are two, SMS and TOTP are the two that they're going to offer together. Again, not surprising. You have an open standard RFC, and then you have quick and dirty at roll my own two-factor overnight type, again, Twilio type implementation. So Mail, and I do call up people as I go, like Zoho. MailChimp and OneLogin actually offer 5 methods each, and then Clavid actually offers 6 methods to do two-factor. So when we're talking about adoption, these are the people that you want to work with if at all possible. That's really impressive to see that many options. All right, so here's a graph and a slide that has nothing to do with necessarily security, but I think it's an interesting trend, which is what do we call two-factor? Google in 2011 started this two-step verification craziness, in my opinion. Historically, if you were to ask me 10 years ago and I was working at, as a sysadmin or a Unix admin, oh, we need to do better security, I'd say use multi-factor authentication. I wouldn't call it two-factor, I'd say MFA. And I think it's one of those things that's like pop and soda almost. It's like wherever you grew up, that's what you call this kind of thing. I've been interested in seeing after Google did 2SV, what was the adoption of that moniker versus 2FA versus MFA, that kind of thing. And certainly you saw a ramp up. So after Google launched in, I think it was January, February 2011, the next year you see almost doubling of what people are implementing two-factor as for a moniker. And then you start seeing it tearing back down. And I think it is good that it's going away because it only begs questions when people see that. They're like, well, Google supports two-step verification, but you're selling two-factor. What is... And it's just like, I could tell you or try to tell you what the hell the difference is supposed to be, but I don't think it's going to matter to you at the end of the day. So that's been an interesting thing. And then when you see the other marked there, that comes down to a lot of branding, a lot of sexy features that we offer. So we're not going to call it two-factor or two-step. We're going to make up our own bullshit like marketing lingo for this feature, just to confuse people even more on what they're doing with security. Certainly, I saw really terrifying things when I managed and worked in 141 services. This one with NameSafe, if you don't have your two-factor credential, and I think there's, I'm not sure if people have done this. I haven't seen really comprehensive research, but two-factor recovery is a really, really interesting thing to me. And this is an example of how not to do two-factor recovery, which is let people do more one-factor recovery. If you can bypass two-factor by having shitty questions like favorite color, that's not helping the security. It's security theater at that point, right? So that's concerning. If you see this kind of stuff, call bullshit. If anyone works for NameSafe in this room, bullshit. This is a terrible idea. Don't do that. All right, so that's kind of the two-factor part of this equation. Again, I want to look at the broader picture, so now we're going to talk about some other things. Being that this is PasswordsCon, I don't know what background in security all of you in the room have, so here's a bit of a giant glossary. If there's something that you don't know, just check it out really quick while I narrate over this section. But getting back to users, if we're looking at web services and we're looking at authentication security, you'd be remiss to ignore all of the browser security features and things that we as users rarely actually see because it's all done in headers or cookie flags. And a lot of the work, if you take something like content security policy, which everyone pretty much has unless you had a greenfield website you just came up with like last week, everyone's had to retrofit if they've deployed CSP and take out inline everything and actually do things somewhat the right way in terms of inclusion of scripts and style sheets and all this other stuff. So some of these are easy. Some of these are like just flip a switch, set a header, whatever. Content security policy takes some actual work to get done and actually implement the right way. But what's concerning is most of these things are flipping switches. And the fact that a lot of places, as you'll find out, don't use them is kind of like, oh, well, getting back to my premise of we're controlling for two-factor, my assumption was people are doing two-factor care about security and will do more security-forward things. That's not true. So for all you actual data scientists in the room, I realize these data sets and the disparity in counts across things are probably going to make you sick to your stomach. I'm fully aware of that, and I apologize in advance. However, I wanted to at least have some segments to look at things somewhat independently. So looking across all these values, you have overall percentage of usage, and then in each column you have per sector percentage of usage. Green values mean for that security control, that won or tied in certain cases for the best percentage across a segment. Red means it lost effectively across that segment. Now for me, and again, data sets being very skewed as they are, I think there's still some logic to take out of this. So for instance, gaming. Most people that have gaming websites, even if they have two-factor, the amount of time people spend on the gaming website is very little. It's usually like administrative type actions that people don't really think about until they have to, buy a new game or something. It's a very low touch scenario. Okay, so spending time on browser security for those companies may not really be something they think too hard on. However, whereas social media, a lot of people spend a lot of time in the browser for these social media sites, and there's also a high risk of client-side attacks. So in those cases, these people, and they're also generally newer companies, they have more agile security teams, they don't have a lot of technical debt. So in a lot of times, we're going to see people that are going to be more apt to implement some security features in browser. And then technology is just a crazy mess because in 83 sites, of course, you're going to have low and high, and we'll have some mean median mode data later, so you can kind of see like a little bit more relationship data there. But yeah, I guess I wasn't too surprised by these two where they set. And overall, the one thing that I assumed would be the case is CSP. CSP, it's new. It's still becoming a thing in some ways. And people are really scared of it because it makes them have to do work and redo code and talk to their development teams. And it's a lot of work. So unless you can build greenfields or you have a really good development and security team relationship, like, companies like, Duo Security, like we have a really good development team, we have a really good security team, and together we like, hey, CSP is important to our admin console, we should do, two-factor or CSP on it. The cookie stuff's frustrating. You would think in a lot of cases that if you had secure, you would also have HTTP only or vice versa. Now, there are certain reasons why people don't do that way, usually because it's a bad practice, but we actually don't see a one-to-one where if you have one cookie flag, you use the other cookie flag and similar. So I like winners. Anytime you do data, I think people should win and people should lose. That's what I believe. So of all those security headers and the cookie security we just talked about, these four were the only ones that had, out of 141, that had all of those features enabled for their users. So 4 out of 141, you would like maybe a little bit better than that, certainly. Again, so Kraken, I'm not a big Bitcoin person, which I realize in a PasswordsCon, the crazy stuff you guys do with like graphics cards, some of you might be very, very big into Bitcoin at this point. Kraken, I've never heard of, and I was horribly shocked to see them among 3 companies that I know very well and are very security forward and make that very obvious. So that was great to see. If I was going to get into some sort of Bitcoin endeavor, I would definitely look at Kraken for some of that those aspects. Now, I should mention, because again, CSP, nascent, hard to implement, coming up the ranks in terms of what people know about it. There were 12 more companies aside from these that did have everything except for CSP. So still, you're talking 16 out of 141. Not awesome. I always think it's interesting, especially because I literally looked at every single set of headers. I didn't automate this because I didn't want to miss stuff. And this is some of the stuff I would have missed, which is fun headers. So you have the like, oh, you should be on our like elite hacking team because you looked at browser headers. I don't know how that's actually a hiring mechanism, but it is. And then app.net, which I'll talk about a little later, you'll find out about them. But app.net, I thought it was cool that they had the Heartbleed header. I wasn't aware of that. I guess I missed that in the 100 million articles about Heartbleed somewhere, that was a thing. And that's pretty cool because it tells you when you were rekeyed for Heartbleed if you were affected, which is pretty handy. SSL. So this is one of those data sets that I was expecting a lot worse than it came out. I thought this actually came out pretty well. The things that were miserable and the things that failed, I was very appalled by. The most appalling thing to me, which hopefully you will appreciate, there's a company out of Australia called SSL Trust, and you know what they do by their name, right? They actually got a C rating on their own TLS implementation because they enabled 40 and 56-bit cipher suites. This is a company that gives out certs for a living, and they can't even use like basic TLS implementation best practices. So that was terrifying. Star Wars Old Republic supported SSL v2 because YOLO, I guess. I don't know. And then most of the ones that were that received an F rating, the OpenSSL CCS vulnerability that happened, it's just a patch problem at that point. They probably just need to like apt-get update and they'd be all set. And I saw a lot of this, where you juxtapose the awesome security statements of companies saying that like we super duper care about security and we're here for you and privacy is everything to us, and then they don't take the time to have a basic implementation of SSL working. You kind of question at what point the security lip service versus the actual security comes in. And to jump back a slide, I think this is a really simple indicator of focus and effort because it takes no time as a sysadmin to run SSL labs on your site. It takes no time to say like, oh, this is the thing I need to fix. And then the instructions that are right next to the thing that tells you you need to fix it, go in and fix it as the operations person. So that really concerns me. And a great example of where it's like, oh, you have two-factor. Of course you do security well. No, they don't. They actually, there's a lot of companies that do it terribly still. So going back to winners and losers, of the ones that we looked at, who were the winners out of the headers and cookie security stuff, if we look at the SSL, and let's just go big or go home, right? So the A+ SSL implementation ratings, two companies still stood, LastPass and GitHub. If you want to be pedantic, I would actually say GitHub won because GitHub for X-Frames options actually had deny, whereas LastPass had same origin. So if you want to be really, really picky, that would, I guess, make them the official winner. One site out of 141 doesn't use SSL for logins. Garena, whatever. They do JavaScript crypto for all their login security. I don't know why. They apparently just thought that was cool or something. But yeah, they literally have no SSL cert. There's no SSL endpoint. It just, it doesn't go anywhere. So that's concerning. Moving on. Getting back to gaming things and bad things. One other thing I looked at that I don't think most people expect you to look at, but I think is actually kind of important and interesting at least to think about, is security pages. If you're looking at someone's presence of mind for security, how hard is it to write 2 paragraphs on the fact that you use TLS and the fact you have two-factor and the fact you do CSP or whatever controls you have in place, or just telling your users, hey, this is an important site to you, and this, financial data is here, so you should do these things to protect yourself. So here's 3 examples of really bad, shitty, examples. So getting back to app.net, so they had a really cool Heartbleed header thing that they took time to implement. This is literally all they talk about for how they do security at app.net. One very just generalized security statement. And that sucks. It's like, okay, you took all this time to have a Heartbleed header, but you couldn't write a paragraph on why you do security and why people should use you as a provider. And then a couple more down here. Again, it's, copy pasta. I found someone's privacy page at one point and just ripped out what they had and popped it on my site. And to me, that just shows a lack of enthusiasm for security. It shows that you might be doing things good or bad or somewhere in the middle, But at the end of the day, you should be communicating that. And I think a lack of communication is one reason why security and end users don't really mesh up half the time, because we're not vocalizing that you could be doing this to protect yourself, or this is the way that we differentiate how we do security versus our competitors. And that's kind of a lost moment for some people. Now, percentage-wise, could have been a lot worse, but 90 sites out of the 141 actually did have what I consider, in my very subjective type viewpoint, a full-fledged security page. So that percentage, 90 versus 51 is actually pretty redeeming in my opinion. Of those, the domain registration and DNS services, not one of the 15 sites that fall in that kind of lumped up category of domain stuff, not one of them had a security page, which is really concerning, especially when we see people getting owned via fax machine in 2014. You would think that these providers that ultimately are a super great target for attackers, because hey, I don't need to root your box, I just need to redirect your DNS and own your site by doing that. You would think they'd put a little bit more effort into being security forward. Again, considering these all have two-factor in the first place, that kind of doesn't mesh up. Even better, though, than general security is bug bounty, right? Talking about whether it's coordinated disclosure, responsible, whatever you want to call it, people that take enough time to tell you how to report vulnerabilities, have a GPG key, have a security at email address, really thinking through how they want the community or their customers to work with them to ensure security. So that's people like Google and Facebook, not a shock. CoinKite has a really, really good security page. And again, if I'm looking at that kind of space and I want to get into Bitcoin, I'm probably going to take a look at them because they took the time to tell me how they're doing things that I should trust them more than Mt. Gox, which, so take all these things, right? We've got browser security with headers and cookie security flags. We've got the transport layer. All of these already have two-factor we know about. And then kind of the corporate view on security and transparency and discussing how they protect you or help protect you. And then we say, like, we have a lot of data points. And if you have data points, you can, do some fuzzy math. If you're like me and have no idea what they're doing, you can create Massacre. Massacre is my shitty attempt at scoring all these various things in a very simplistic way and kind of coming up with a composite score of authentication security for a site, okay? Before I move to the next slide, I guarantee everyone will have an opinion on why my number system is wrong, and I fully agree with you. But the problem is you all disagree with each other too, I bet, so good luck. So this is what I did. First off, again, two factors in the mix. And as an authentication security control, to me, two factors are great control. So I weighted that pretty high at 15 points. If you had what I consider a reasonably proper SSL implementation, again, people aren't going to be stealing your credentials, man, the million stuff is easily, so great, that's good stuff, big points. And then CSP. We know not a lot of people do it, and we know people don't do it because it takes effort. But we do know when people implement it, in terms of client-side attacks, it's a hugely, hugely helpful way to prevent a lot of bad things from befalling on your users. So again, a big score of 15 for those. And then you get like the kind of middle ground stuff. And I had these, I could write a novel about what my thought process was on some of this stuff, but HTTP only, again, super simple flag to turn on. For most attacks, will stop really simple cross-site scripting from grabbing your cookies and grabbing your session. That's cool. HTTP only if you get into a situation where someone can own your session and actually intercept that cookie. HSTS. So basically, if you don't go to that site with SSL, but you've been there and they sent the header, you will go to that site with SSL always, and that helps prevent a lot of the man-in-the-middle attacks that we see. So again, a big range of data, 100-point scales make things nice and easy, and that's kind of what I came up with for that. So if you break this down in 20-point segments, who knows what that screenshot's from? Huh? Doom, yeah. I don't know, as soon as I Googled, I was like, Massacre, what? First off, don't Google image search Massacre. That was my first mistake. especially without safe search on. That was terrifying. Once I got past that, I was like, what represents what? I need a scale. And for whatever reason, I thought of Doom immediately. So this is roughly a 20-point scale. That's technically 21 points, but, you know, whatever. So 20-point scale, and you see the distribution. So not a huge shock. Middle ground here, right? You get a lot of sites that fall in the middle ground. You have some really good sites. You have some really shitty sites, and then kind of everything else just splattered in the middle. Of course, a nightmare, I think, is accurate if you are between 0 and 20 points on this scale. So, back to winners and losers. Hopefully you don't see a lot of people you're using up here for the losers column of things. But we knew GitHub, Kraken, and LastPass all had a perfect score. So that's cool to see. Facebook is not a shock to anyone. Fastmail is probably not a shock to anyone for their forwardness on security. Losers, EasyDNS. Super concerned about a score of 15 because guess what that means? All they have is two-factor, and remember, everyone had two-factor. So they have the worst score out of all 141 sites I tested. So if you want to have DNS hosted with someone, maybe not use them. And then broken down by actual, kind of technology segment or however you want to call it. As a user of it, I'm super concerned of Hootsuite score. That was really, really concerning, especially getting back to the fact that a lot of corporations use Hootsuite because they're worried about getting their individual social media accounts owned. So they centralize them, and then they have two-factor, and it's like, oh, this is a great solution. Well, not if your man in browser inject, a session or something, right? That's concerning. So, so kind of apples to apples overall versus individual segments. Pretty much as expected. We see retail is a little bit higher. We see social is reasonably higher, and gaming's a little bit lower. If you think back to the chart we had that showed all this kind of built out, remember that social media had really good scores overall. Gaming had really bad scores overall. So this kind of data, doesn't shock anyone probably. This, however, I find this fascinating because remember, we're talking individual security features broken out or individual rankings in terms of the SSL. So if you're a site that had CSP enabled, remember CSP is worth 15 points. So if you look at the overall values and then you look at the CSP, there's a dramatic jump there in terms of how well you do overall security. So this is cool because you can kind of, and again, I know there's actual data people in here, you can kind of make some inferences about if you have a certain security feature enabled, what's the likelihood you're going to have a lot of security features enabled or little security features enabled. SSL, of course, you drop off the map very quickly if you don't have SSL or you have an F score. So here's to make all you guys and girls in this room happy. Massacre is bad and you should feel bad. I do. I do not algorithm. That's why you got the scoring scale you just saw. And I try to make my data accurate, but I make no actual claims that anything's accurate. So what I did, of course, when you have a giant data set and a scoring algorithm, all this other stuff, I made a browser plugin or Chrome extension. And so it's literally just a JSON export of all this data. And then when you hit the host match, you get this data set. So if you go to a site that has it enabled, you'll get the score, you'll get all their content, and some other interesting details, such as what methods of two-factor did they enable. I actually hunted down, I want to say like 135 of 141 sites when they actually deployed two-factor, which is way harder than I would have expected and really burned a lot of my time. But it tells you when they deployed it and gives you some other insight, as well as how to enable two-factor and then links to their corporate security page. So if you go to one of these 141 sites, which of course across the internet, pretty small number of probably where you go, but it's one of those things. So I'll eventually be releasing the data set so that you guys can parse and enjoy and figure out how terrible I did. And then also, if you want the extension, I'll be releasing that as well. So, but that's not all. Something else I looked at, breaches, and trying to make some relationships between breaches and how that affects security and so on and so forth. So, breach, as I'm going to define, does not, despite all the Googling I did that wants me to believe, does not include denial of service. It does not include targeted phishing attacks against people that were dumb to click on things or smart, and it was just a really good phish. So this is, in my definition of breach, there is a public mention of someone having either stolen data or someone having access to corporate systems. Because even if someone says, oh, no data was stolen, nah, they might not know for sure. But if you say like, oh, someone had like remote code execution in my environment, I'm gonna call that a breach, because that's my opinion. If we look at these data points and you look across segments, you can get some, a little bit of interesting data. What didn't pan out from my assumption was that companies that hadn't been breached, or companies that hadn't been breached, would have a better score. And again, I think because of the data set skewing that happened here, that's not the case. Companies that were breached actually had a better score. Now, one argument that some of you might be thinking is, well, you were testing this modern times, like I'm doing this all like real data, real time. So if a company was breached, perhaps they improved their security over people that hadn't been breached yet. So that, yep, go ahead.
You were testing security versus the client, and all those breaches are happening on the corporate side. What is the relationship between the actual parameters that you were testing with regards to client security or communication security with the client versus the breach at the corporate side?
Yep, I'll actually be pairing that with some of that data in a second. But part of it is, and getting back to what I was just explaining, if you have been breached and you're in the focus of everyone on the internet now that you've been breached, you might be sandbagging a little bit for security features. So again, the data set and the skew and everything else, I'm not going to make any like full assertions, but it could be that these sites that had been breached had more security, and the sites that didn't get breached yet are still just kind of like resting on their laurels until they do get breached, and we'll see if they kind of sandbag and add features to make people, feel safe again, right? It's all about the illusion of security. So getting back to your question, one thing I looked at, because I had a deployment date and I had a breach date. Those are the only dates I had, because everything else, God to find out when a header was implemented on a site. That would be really, really not fun. So the dates I did have, I used those and said, did two-factor get implemented before or after, how soon after, that kind of stuff. So of 37 services that both had a deployment date and breach, 54% of them actually already had two-factor. So the assumption that everyone adds two-factor because they got breached doesn't necessarily track. Some companies were actually security forward and tried adding client security before a breach. They weren't just saying like, oh, we got breached and we lost all your password hashes or clear text passwords probably. Therefore, we will implement two-factor to make you feel better about the next time we get breached and all your passwords get stolen. Of the 19 services that added two-factor after a breach, it was actually an average of 255 days before they actually implemented two-factor, median 128. Again, calling out people that deserve it. Linode, Dropbox, MaxCDN, and Buffer all took less than a month to deploy two-factor after a breach. So this is very, very reactive. This is getting back to the how do people decide on when to add security controls, why do they add security controls. Anything in a 30-day window is probably indicative of this was reactive to the fact we got breached, and we want people to trust us and feel better about what we're doing and how we're doing things. Of the ones that did get breached and then added two-factor, 74% of those have TOT-P, compared to 52% across all sites. So a pretty big high, a jump than the average total of sites. Part of that is TOT-P, free to implement effectively, right? It's open standard. You can roll your own. You can use the Oath toolkit and wrap it in your code and deploy TOT-P very quickly. You don't have to make your customers pay for an app or anything else. So that probably explains a little bit of that. And then across those sites, 63% have two methods of doing two-factor. And again, comparatively, 49% across all services. So a higher average than all services do for their implementation. I actually added this kind of a last-minute thing because it's one thing to look at just services implementing it, but also what about the two-factor providers, right? So the SaaS providers out there, of which Duo Security is of course one of them, and thank God we didn't lose because I didn't tell our ops team I was doing this. So if we had really bad scores, I'd be like, that sucks. We should have done better in the first place. But in this case, this was shocking to me. You all see a lot of red on there, don't you? like way more red than anyone should probably see, especially when we're talking authentication security and the central mechanism by which you have a security control. These are all SaaS services that all have a customer login on their website. So like notably excluded in here is Twofer. Like I actually like the Twofer guys a lot. They don't have a customer login because that's not really how they do things. So they're not included. It's not because I, pushed them out or anything. But Duo Security and LaunchKey did, I think, reasonably well. Authy, I think they're just kind of getting hosed because of the SSL score. They need to fix the CCS vulnerability in that web server. But everyone else, oops, really, I think I just broke everything. Really concerning. Text Power, I never heard of before I tried looking around for like SaaS two-factor providers. I don't know how they get by with what they do, but it's not great to see. So moving on from this, my caveat is right in there for everyone that already hates me. I initially had planned to actually have relationship data between password quality. So like Dashlane, for instance, just did a reasonably nice password quality. They released their methodology. They did scoring. I thought they did a nice job. And I actually plan to use their methodology to do scoring, but I'm going to actually look at password quality, factor that into the scoring algorithm, and get another, more resolution into how end user authentication. Keeping in mind, you probably could add about another 100 aspects to this process, and depending on what you whether you're kind of in the attacker space, the blue team space, your focus on why and how and when and where that you should add more types and whatever could vary pretty widely. Cross origin policy. There's a lot of things you could add. These were kind of my hit list. So by October, I plan to actually do the password scoring quality. I'll be uploading the data set for that, and then also uploading the new slides when that happens. And then again, as we saw the trend line of what's coming out, who's adding two-factor, assumably I'll have a lot more data to add over the next couple months, or at least by October, maybe not that much data, but I'll add more sites as they come up, get better data resolution. Hopefully retail and social and some other sites add more, so I have a little bit better data set to look at. So that part is all I'm going to keep saying is data research is really tiring. Spreadsheets are really tiring. I'm just going to go back to breaking stuff because it's much easier. But overall, having to look up dates for things and release pages and announcements and talking on Twitter and emailing companies, and it takes a lot more time than I clearly expected. If, though, as someone that has done penetration testing and a lot of other things on an operational side and development, all this shit falls apart if you still write crappy code and implement security wrong, right? You can have all these features, but if there's a two-factor bypass, if there's a password authentication bypass, if you let people use a cookie and set admin equals true, like none of this matters, right? So at the end of the day, these are all really proactive things. They help reduce your attack surface. They help mitigate threat. They, blah, blah, blah. But it still comes down to, does your code suck? And if it does, you're going to get owned. Simple things like checking SSL labs, making sure your site doesn't have an F rating for your authentication page. And that's one thing I didn't really mention directly, which I should have. All those SSL lab scores, all the headers, all of the cookies, that is on the login portion of the site. So maybe not the home page, whatever. This is like as close to the purpose of why we're talking about authentication security, right? Is the authentication, the login part. So for what that's worth. Dominic's in the crowd. We have really just some crazy smart interns at Duo Security. We're really lucky to have. Vikas, who isn't here, and then Dominic did a lot of the labor for me when I realized how screwed I was and how much data I had to accrue. So they really helped me. Twofactorauth.org, if you haven't gone there, you really should. They have a really nicely broken out instructions on how to enable two-factor for a ton of sites, roughly what method, software versus token, stuff like that. So if you are looking to enable two-factor for your usage as a consumer or business or whatever, check them out. And then my buddy Steve Werby actually did kind of similar research. Some of the things I did in my research, he wanted to do and just never did. So I've got to give him a huge nod. And part of why I held passwords for last is because part of what he did was focusing on password quality, and he had to like mechanical Turk it out and try to get like people across the world to farm this data for him. And I was just like, I'm going to pick a smaller data set that has a little bit more focus on it and not do it that way. So I've got about 12 minutes, so anyone have questions? Yeah.
Many of the browser security features should be testable automatically in some way. I think it would not be possible through a web page, but probably through a browser plugin. Have you thought about that? Because for the SSL thing, I think this SSL labs test really increased the awareness of these issues. Because if you have this A+, it just looks good for marketing. Yeah. Should I repeat or? So if we could have a test that says this page has CSP, this page has secure cookies, etc., and then give some rating, I think this could increase awareness of those things. And another thing, for CSP you gave just 15 points, but it depends a lot on how you implement it. Because if you have insecure inline or whatever the flag is called, then CSP doesn't help much.
No, that's a great point. And the trick, so I'll answer your first point, and both points I 100% agree with. In terms of doing live scoring, the problem is things like, first, SSL labs, unless you have a cached page, can take like 30 to 60 seconds, 90 seconds to run. And then sometimes if they have like a load balancer or something, you'll get multiple results, and then you have to pick which result you want. So unless you had cached data on SSL labs already, retrieving it live would never really be super great as a mechanism, because it'd be super slow and no one would wait around to see it. Things like the getting back to content security policy, the same could be said for two-factor, like definitely in-band versus out-of-band two-factor. Like you can make huge statements on, well, if you're putting a compromised browser and passing a OTP through, and someone can jack that and then terminate your connection and then use your login credentials and OTP, did you really get security? So it's really hard, and that's why the static data set made sense to me, because there are certain things, so like session cookies. There are cookies, as I found out looking at 141 sites, there are cookies that are session cookies, but they're not the session cookie for the authentication session. So, and there are cookies that aren't session cookies that are actually the cookie that is used for the session. And so that's one of those things, in a lot of cases, if it's like a J session ID or PHP session, like those are usually pretty consistent. But there's some crazy shit people do with cookies that don't make any sense. And only by looking at one site at a time and actually evaluating what was used for a session handling could I actually score that accurately. And the other thing is, some sites don't apply cookie security across, actually I'd say most sites don't apply across the board. So some sites will have HTTP only for one cookie, secure for another cookie, and it's a mess. So I'm sure if you put some reasonable intelligence, you probably could do pretty good, except for some edge cases. But again, I was looking for accuracy rather than kind of guessing. So, but yeah, great points for sure. Any other questions?
Maybe an interesting industry or segment to apply this research to, or provide the insights to, is the whole cloud security, like all those infrastructure as a service or software as a service, all those services that are actually expanding the corporate infrastructure and the application surface. They should have all those controls implemented. So maybe the Cloud Security Alliance is a good organization to present this research to, and maybe have it in one of their recommendation papers.
I would be concerned and humbled at the same time if they ever took this that seriously. I think the general principle here is a good principle to have. I think composite scoring, taking a lot of data points and trying to get some sense of how security forward companies are, or what your actual risk is by using a certain service, is great. So if anyone wants to take this idea, which I think hopefully this is not a shocking idea to come up with in the first place, but please build off this, throw away my model, make a better point scoring system, tell me about it. I'd love to know about it. If this inspires someone to look down that road, that would be more than I could hope for with all of this research. But certainly I think consumers really appreciate green, yellow, and maybe not for terrorist alerts, but like, green, yellow, red as a mechanism by which they kind of understand security, and certainly point scales, A, B, C, D, E, F. That's why I think SSL Labs works really well. So if we could go down a road, and we could, the hard part I think is consensus, because how many people would have completely different scoring than I had? at least one score different than I had, right? I would bet, yeah, right. And so the trick there is getting back to your great point, CSP. One thing I will say is I made sure at least all these were in forced CSP and not in actually, testing mode. But you would have to start doing quality assessment, just like passwords, right? What's the entropy? You have to do scoring of how many sources of inline styles or inline scripts do they have? How many glob subdomains do they have for CSP? You'd have to score each component individually at a very granular level to really get the kind of resolution in that type of control to make it worthwhile. And that's a shit ton of work. And I bless you if you can do it. I was not going to do that. But yeah, simple things like cookie headers, again, it gets not simple when you don't know which of the 1,000 cookies you just sent me is actually the one unless you really look into it and try to figure it out. So huge, thing to climb, but I think there's some value here. And yeah, if anyone wants to take this on, please go crazy. I think it's something that would resonate with a lot of people online, and especially getting back to the browser extension. People have 20 browser extensions per client now, so maybe that would resonate as well. So, any other questions? Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed the research, and let me know if you have questions later. Contact me and get some decks later. Thanks.